In the first lesson, we learned the essence of God's law. It's everything He requires of people, do's and don'ts. It also lays down consequences for disobedience and obedience. If we obey God perfectly, we have the promise of His love and blessing on earth and eternal life in heaven. If we fail to obey Him perfectly, we have the promise of His wrath and punishment on earth and eternal death in hell. Now we're moving forward with an overview of just what God requires us to do and not to do. What exactly does He want from us? First, the simplest summary available. We'll hear Jesus say, "Love God and love your neighbor." Then a slightly more detailed summary of God's law, the 10 Commandments. First, we'll look at Matthew chapter 22. A little historical background first. The Pharisees and Sadducees were two groups of Jewish leaders who didn't like Jesus and wanted to get rid of Him. Their hatred only grew as time went on. It reached a climax during Jesus' final week in Jerusalem before He was crucified. They often tried to trap Jesus by asking Him difficult questions, and that's what's going on here. The Sadducees had just failed in trying to get Jesus to say something wrong, so now the Pharisees took a turn. They thought they could trap Him in His words by getting Him to say that one commandment was more important than other commandments. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested Him with this question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments." So, as always, Jesus turned their intended trap into a teachable moment. What's the greatest commandment in the law? I'll give you the greatest 2 commandments. The greatest commandment, love God with all your being. Notice how this is really just a paraphrase of the first commandment, you shall have no other gods. The second greatest commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. So love God and love your neighbor, the 2 greatest commandments. In fact, all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. What does that mean? All God's laws depend on these 2 laws. If you always love God and love your neighbor, you'll always keep all the rest of God's laws, because they are simply applications of these 2 chief commandments. 2 important words in this passage are love and neighbor. We need to know their definitions. The word love has been largely emptied of meaning the way people usually use it today. Usually it just means to like something an awful lot. I love ice cream. I loved that movie. In the Bible, love isn't an intense liking or a warm and fuzzy feeling. It's an attitude you have towards someone. Love is an attitude that considers someone else to be more important than you are. You're more important to me than I am. The other word is neighbor. We might think of someone that lives on our street. In the Bible, the definition is much broader. My neighbor is anyone I come into contact with, anyone who crosses my path in life. So applying those definitions to Jesus' words, if I love God, I will never worship another God. If I love my neighbor, I will never hurt him, steal from him, give false testimony against him. Love is all the commandments in a nutshell. If we always consider it our pleasure to serve God and everyone else, all the other commandments will fall into place. We'll always keep them perfectly. Now we'll move on to the slightly more detailed summary of God's law in the 10 Commandments. Let's put them into their historical context. About 1400 BC, the Israelites are slaves in Egypt. God sends Moses to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to say, "Let my people go." After 10 plagues, Pharaoh finally complies. The Israelites cross the Red Sea and start making their way toward the land God promised to their forefather Abraham. But on the way, God has a detour planned to Mount Sinai right around here. This is where He will give them the 10 Commandments. It would be helpful here to read Exodus chapters 19 and 20. God tells Moses He's going to make a covenant with the people. To prepare for the special day, they were to do some special things. They were to do their laundry and abstain from sexual relations. They were also to set boundaries around the mountain. God was coming and no one should get too close. If anyone got too close, they should be killed. 3 days later, God comes, and there's no mistaking that he's come. There's thunder and lightning, trumpet blasts, fire and smoke. The whole mountain was shaking. And then came the most frightful thing of all, God's own voice. Normally we associate the 10 Commandments with tablets of stone, but the first time God gave the commandments, it was with his own mouth. The commandments, as written on the screen, are summaries, pretty much as written in Luther's Small Catechism. You can read Exodus chapter 20 for the full speech. What was the Israelites' reaction after hearing the 10 Commandments? They were scared to death. They said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die." Why were they scared? Well, they were standing in the presence of God and hearing his commandments, which they knew they hadn't kept. Who wouldn't be scared? It's worth mentioning that not everyone numbers the commandments the same way. God tells us there are 10, but he doesn't number them in the Bible. Most Protestant churches divide the first commandment into 2. Lutherans and Roman Catholics divide the last commandment into 2. The way we number them is really neither here nor there. What's important is that we recognize them as God's law and that we obey them. God spoke the commandments the first time he gave them, but he also had Moses come up Mount Sinai afterwards to get a hard copy on 2 tablets of stone. You may have seen graphics of the stone tablets that list 3 commandments on one side and 7 on the other. The purpose of that is to reflect the 2 types of law contained in the 10 Commandments. The first 3, sometimes called the first table of the law, address what is required in my relationship with God. The next 7, sometimes called the second table of the law, address what is required in my relationship with my neighbor. So there you have the 2 basic summaries of what God requires of people. These aren't all-inclusive. This isn't all the Bible has to say. They are summaries. At the foundation of all of God's laws is the requirement to love God and love your neighbor. In the next lessons, we're going to study the 10 Commandments individually. I would recommend, however, that you first watch the brief lesson, How do the 10 Commandments apply to us today?